Thanks for watching. When this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a special giveaway, and one lucky new subscriber will win an iPhone 15 Pro Max. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss your chance.
At 6:42 p.m., my phone vibrated once, not with the sharp insistence of an emergency alert, but with the muted hesitation of a system unsure whether it should speak at all. No sound followed. No banner filled the screen. Just a short message flagged as restricted, routed through an agency channel I'd never seen before, warning of localized instability and advising personnel to remain where they were until further notice. I wasn't personnel. I wasn't supposed to see it. Outside my apartment window, the city looked unchanged. Traffic lights cycled on schedule. People crossed intersections with grocery bags swinging at their sides. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck hissed as its brakes released. The warning sat on my screen without context, unsupported by sirens, news crawls, or social media panic. I refreshed every app I had. Nothing matched what I'd read. 5 minutes later, a second message arrived, this one even shorter. Access limitations pending. Avoid transit corridors. Await verification. It vanished when I tried to open it again, replaced by a generic network error. That was when I understood the problem wasn't the outbreak itself. It was the silence around it. I stepped into the hallway and listened. Neighbors were arguing about something mundane. A television blared sports commentary through a thin wall, and someone laughed, loud and careless. If something was happening, it was moving faster than public awareness could keep up. Systems were already reacting, quietly, selectively, while the rest of the city continued as if the night belonged to routine. I went outside and walked 2 blocks towards the subway entrance. The digital sign above the stairs was dark, unpowered, even though the station lights below still glowed. A uniformed transit worker stood at the top, hands clasped, telling commuters the trains were delayed without explanation. No one pushed back. They just turned around, annoyed rather than afraid. Across the street, a federal building I passed every day had lowered its exterior shutters halfway, enough to notice if you were looking, easy to miss if you weren't. A temporary barrier blocked the service driveway, set up hastily, cones still stacked beside it. This wasn't a lockdown. It was something narrower, more deliberate, as if decisions were being made in layers, with information rationed alongside movement. My phone buzzed again. This time the message didn't come through at all. The screen flashed, then went black for a full second before returning to the home display. Signal strength dropped, then recovered. I realized I was watching containment protocols initiate in real time, not for people, but for knowledge. I turned away from the subway and started walking uphill, toward an area marked on city maps as restricted infrastructure. No residential zoning, no public access. I'd never had a reason to go there before. Now instinct told me the places people weren't allowed were already being prepared, while everywhere else was being left to figure things out on its own. Behind me, the city carried on, unaware of the fracture running beneath it. Ahead, the streetlights grew farther apart, and the cameras mounted on the poles pointed inward, toward a zone the warnings never mentioned out loud. I crossed the last open intersection before the signage changed, knowing the first night hadn't officially begun, but already understanding that whatever was coming would not wait for permission to be acknowledged. The first sign wasn't the fence. It was the absence of anything beyond it. The street narrowed as I approached, lanes fading into unmarked pavement, storefronts replaced by blank concrete walls with no signage and no windows. This part of the city existed without invitation. A metal barrier stretched across the road ahead, not tall, not reinforced, just enough to suggest that anyone continuing did so by choice. I stepped around it without slowing, aware that hesitation would feel like guilt. Beyond the barrier, the air felt different. Not cleaner, not colder, just managed. The hum of traffic thinned until it disappeared entirely, replaced by a low, steady vibration I felt through the soles of my shoes. Cameras followed the road at regular intervals, their lenses angled inward, tracking movement without acknowledgement. No alarms sounded. No lights changed. The system noticed me and decided not to react. A sign stood near the curb, reflective paint catching the glow of a single street lamp. Authorized access only, federal use, no trespassing. The language was blunt, stripped of consequence. There was no mention of penalties, no warning of enforcement, just a statement of fact. I crossed beneath it, understanding that whatever rules applied here were enforced long before anyone reached the point of arrest. The entrance came into view slowly, designed to be missed unless you already knew where to look. A recessed loading bay cut into the side of a long structure, doors set back from the road and partially shadowed. There were no guards, no vehicles, no visible activity. The building looked dormant but not abandoned. Lines of light traced along its upper edges, too even to be accidental. I paused at the threshold, not because I expected resistance, but because stepping inside meant accepting a kind of permanence. Outside, confusion still offered options. Inside, there would only be whatever had already been decided. I reached for the handle and found it unlocked, heavier than it looked, swinging inward with controlled resistance. The door closed behind me without sound. The space beyond was wide and unfinished, concrete floors polished smooth, walls segmented by access panels marked with coded identifiers. Overhead, lights adjusted automatically, brightening just enough to remove shadows without creating warmth. I was alone, yet unmistakably accounted for. Every instinct told me I had crossed into something operational. Not as a guest, but as an irregularity. This place wasn't meant to keep people out for safety. It was meant to remain untouched so it could function without interruption. By entering, I hadn't found shelter. I had inserted myself into a system that wasn't designed to care whether I survived, only whether it continued to perform its purpose through the night. I moved deeper, each step echoing once before being absorbed, as if the architecture itself resisted noise. Directional arrows were painted on the floor, faded but deliberate, guiding equipment. Not people, I ignored them at first, then realized the hallways subtly curved to realign me anyway, narrowing choices without closing paths. The design favored flow over comfort, efficiency over clarity. It felt less like a building and more like an interface. A secondary door slid open as I approached, triggered by proximity rather than permission. The mechanism was smooth, practiced, indifferent. Past it, the temperature dropped slightly, enough to register without demanding attention. Somewhere above, ventilation adjusted to compensate for my presence, recalibrating air patterns I couldn't see. I wondered how many variables the system tracked, and how far tolerance extended before anomalies were flagged. I thought about turning back, about the street beyond the barrier, the ordinary danger of crowds and confusion. That world now felt distant, unstructured, loud in a way that wasted energy. Here, everything served a function, even the silence. Whatever had begun outside would eventually reach this place, but it would arrive late, filtered, stripped of chaos. I stopped near a wall marked with an I identifier and rested my palm against the surface. It was warm, machinery operating behind panels, processes running without supervision. This facility wasn't sealed to keep threats out. It was built to keep its work uninterrupted, regardless of what happened beyond its walls. The corridor opened into a wider interior spine, long enough that perspective flattened and distances became difficult to judge. The ceiling rose higher here, studded with recessed panels that emitted a neutral white glow, neither harsh nor welcoming. Nothing flickered. Nothing hummed loudly enough to draw attention. The building didn't feel alive in the way a crowded place does. It felt operational, like a process that had never been paused. To my left, a series of sealed doors ran the length of the wall, each one identical except for small alphanumeric labels stenciled beside their frames. No handles, no keypads, just narrow seams outlining where they might open if instructed. I tried one anyway, pressing my palm against the surface. It was cool, unresponsive, unmoved by pressure or curiosity. Whatever was stored behind it existed beyond negotiation. The floor markings changed as I moved deeper, arrows giving way to segmented bands of color that meant nothing to me. They weren't warnings or guides, they were references for people who already understood the layout. Overhead, vents adjusted almost imperceptibly, redirecting airflow as I passed. The sound was subtle, more felt than heard, like a breath taken in another room. I realized the system wasn't reacting to emergencies. It was maintaining balance. At the center of the spine, a control alcove recessed into the wall, screens mounted vertically in a semicircle. Most were dark, powered but dormant, waiting for input that wasn't coming. One remained active, displaying status readouts that scrolled slowly, too slowly to be urgent. Environmental stability, load distribution, internal pressure differentials. Everything read nominal, as if the outside world had already been excluded from consideration. I stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the implication. This place wasn't abandoned because it had failed. It was empty because it had succeeded in isolating itself from the need for people. Systems had been designed to persist without oversight, to continue their routines whether anyone watched or not. The absence of staff wasn't a sign of evacuation. It was a design choice. A secondary passage branched off to the right, narrower, with a slight incline that suggested deeper levels below. As I stepped into it, lighting shifted again, softening just enough to preserve visibility without encouraging activity. Motion sensors tracked my progress, not to deter me, but to adjust conditions around me. The building didn't challenge my presence. It absorbed it. Halfway down the passage, I noticed something that didn't fit. A rolling chair tucked against the wall, slightly askew, its wheels locked. It wasn't old. The upholstery showed no dust, no fading. Someone had left it there deliberately, not long ago. Nearby, a discarded access badge lay face down, its clip bent as if it had been pulled free too quickly. The name was worn smooth, identity erased through use rather than intent. The realization settled slowly. People hadn't fled in panic. They had disengaged. Whatever protocols governed this place didn't require a dramatic exit. They required absence. The facility functioned best when no one interfered, when human decision-making was removed from the loop entirely. I reached another junction where the corridor split, one path descending further, the other leading toward what looked like habitation modules, small uniform rooms with narrow windows set high in the walls. I checked one. The door opened smoothly, revealing a compact space stripped of personalization. A cot folded into the wall, a metal desk bolted to the floor. No bedding, no personal effects. Temporary occupancy, never meant to become permanent. I didn't linger. Staying in one place felt wrong, like standing still in a current you couldn't see. As I moved back into the corridor, a distant vibration passed through the structure, deep enough that it registered in my chest rather than my ears. Not an impact. Not an alarm. Something cycling on schedule. The building was busy without urgency, prepared without expectation, locked down without sealing itself. Every door that didn't open told me more than the ones that did. This wasn't a refuge waiting to be discovered. It was an environment already committed to its task, indifferent to who noticed it first. Somewhere above, outside these walls, the first night was unfolding in confusion and noise. In here, the systems continued, steady and unconcerned, as if they had been designed with the assumption that when the world finally reached this place, it would arrive too late to matter. I tested the space the way you test ice, with small steps and an ear tuned for fractures. Each movement carried consequences here, not because of alarms, but because the environment answered quietly. Light adjusted when I shifted. Airflow leaned away from my breath. The building didn't instruct me, it measured me. I slowed down, letting the systems finish their calculations before I made another choice. I started by mapping what I could without touching anything permanent. Corridors looped back on themselves in subtle ways, guiding traffic towards central arteries while discouraging lingering. Doors that opened did so with patience, never rushing, as if waiting for permission from somewhere else. I avoided the sealed sections, noting how the floor texture changed near them. Rougher, meant to signal without signage. Sound mattered more than sight. I placed my weight carefully, heel before toe, listening for resonance through the slab. The building absorbed noise unevenly. Some areas swallowed it. Others reflected it back like a warning. I learned where to pause, where to breathe shallow, where to move only when ventilation masked my presence. There were rules here, even if no one had written them down for me. Brightness invited attention from systems I couldn't see. Darkness created gaps, but also uncertainty. I chose gradients instead, dim enough to stay unnoticed, bright enough to avoid mistakes. Balance replaced speed as the guiding principle. I tested utilities next, cautiously. A sink responded with treated water that smelled neutral, neither fresh nor stale. Power outlets carried current, stable but limited, as if capped intentionally. The facility offered support without abundance, enough to function, never enough to forget dependence. Time stretched as I worked through the space, the absence of clocks forcing me to rely on bodily cues. Hunger hadn't arrived yet, but fatigue lurked at the edges. I marked mental checkpoints instead, counting tasks completed rather than minutes passed. Progress became the measure of safety. I avoided leaving traces. Anything moved was returned. Anything opened closed again. The idea wasn't invisibility. It was neutrality. I wanted the environment to read me as temporary, a fluctuation that didn't require response. That meant discipline, resisting the urge to claim space as mine. As the night deepened outside, pressure built in subtle ways. Distant vibrations hinted at activity far beyond the walls, too faint to locate. I adjusted, choosing a position that offered options rather than comfort. Survival here wasn't about hiding from danger. It was about fitting within constraints already set. I realized then that learning the rules wasn't a phase. It was the work itself. Every decision refined my understanding. Every correction narrowed future risk. By the time the facility settled into its nighttime cycle, I had stopped reacting and started operating, shaped by boundaries I hadn't chosen. I chose a corner near intersecting corridors, not hidden, not exposed, where patterns converged. From there I could sense shifts before they reached me, changes in airflow, alterations in lighting rhythm. It felt less like taking shelter and more like aligning myself with a current already moving. Somewhere above, the city's noise rose and fell, a distant surf I could no longer influence. Inside, the facility adjusted to night parameters, conserving energy, smoothing variables. I followed its lead, reducing movement, letting stillness do the work I couldn't. By the time I finally stopped moving, the rules had stopped feeling external. They weren't restrictions anymore, but conditions as natural as gravity. I understood that surviving the first night here meant accepting that adaptation would never end, only change form. Sleep came in fragments, brief descents into shallow rest interrupted by awareness. Each time I surfaced, the environment remained consistent, unchanged by my presence. That reliability was its own warning. Places like this endured by design, not by hope. and I had just begun to learn how to exist inside one. When the systems dimmed further, signaling a deeper cycle, I adjusted again, smaller, slower. The facility accepted that adjustment without comment. The first night wasn't testing me. It was calibrating, and I was letting it. By then, rules felt internal, and survival meant compliance with a logic already written into the walls that shaped every step I took. The first sound I noticed wasn't loud enough to alarm me. It arrived as a pressure change, a subtle shift that made the air feel heavier for a moment before settling again. I paused, holding my breath, listening past my own pulse. Outside noise reached the building as a distant blur. Sirens stretched thin by distance, something breaking far away, a collective murmur that rose and fell without pattern. None of that concerned the facility. Those sounds hit the outer shell and lost their meaning. What caught my attention came from within. It wasn't mechanical failure or movement. It was activity measured, periodic, intentional. Somewhere below my position, a low sequence of tones pulsed through the structure, too slow to be an alarm, too deliberate to be random. I followed the vibration along the corridor, stopping whenever it sharpened, moving when it faded. The source remained hidden, but its rhythm stayed consistent, like a system checking in with itself. I reached a junction where the walls thickened and the ceiling dropped slightly. The acoustics changed there, sound folding inward instead of carrying forward. I stood still and let the space reveal itself. A faint clicking pattern emerged, irregular but repeating, followed by a muted hiss that reminded me of pressure being equalized. These weren't responses to the outbreak. They were part of a cycle already in motion. I tried to reconcile what I was hearing with what I knew of infrastructure, backup generators, environmental stabilizers, redundant monitoring loops. All of it suggested readiness, not reaction. This building wasn't waiting for confirmation. It had already committed to its internal schedule. The contrast unsettled me more than noise from the street ever could. Outside, chaos advertised itself. Inside, order continued without reference to human distress. The facility wasn't sealed off to keep danger out. It was tuned to ignore it. Whatever was happening beyond these walls existed outside its priority set. A new sound joined the pattern, brief, metallic, like something retracting and resetting. It traveled vertically, echoing faintly through shafts I couldn't see. I imagined components shifting position, access points cycling open and closed, processes completing tasks that no longer required supervision. The building was doing work I couldn't identify, and that ignorance carried weight. I adjusted my position, choosing a spot where multiple sound paths intersected. From there I could tell when the internal tones overlapped with outside disturbances. When that happened, the facility didn't amplify or suppress. It compensated, altering its rhythm just enough to maintain equilibrium. That adjustment told me more than any schematic could. This place was designed to endure interference, not respond to it. At one point, a sharper noise cut through the background, a short burst of the static followed by silence. I waited for it to repeat. It didn't. Somewhere a system had attempted communication and failed, then moved on. The building didn't linger on errors. It logged them and continued. I wondered who had last monitored these sounds intentionally, who had listened for changes, interpreted patterns, made decisions based on them. That role no longer existed, or it had been deemed unnecessary. Either way, the absence of human oversight hadn't slowed anything down. As the night progressed, external noise grew louder, closer. I could hear it now even through the insulation, shouting, engines revving too hard, something heavy impacting a structure not built to absorb it. The facility acknowledged none of it. Internal rhythms stayed steady, unaffected by the rising pitch of collapse outside. That indifference forced a realization. Safety here wasn't passive, it was conditional. As long as I didn't interfere, as long as I remained an unregistered variable within acceptable margins, the building would tolerate me. The moment I disrupted its cycles, I would become noise, something to be dampened or removed. I shifted my weight and the tones adjusted, subtle but immediate. The system noticed. It always noticed. That awareness wasn't comforting, it was instructive. Survival here depended on restraint, on learning which sounds belonged and which invited correction. By the time the outside world reached its loudest point so far, the interior had settled into a deeper phase. The tones spaced farther apart. The hissing subsided. The building entered a quieter loop, conserving effort, conserving purpose. I mirrored it, minimizing movement, letting my presence fade into the background hum. Lying there listening to a structure that refused to acknowledge the apocalypse unfolding beyond its walls, I understood that danger wasn't defined by volume. The loudest threats announced themselves. The most serious ones operated without concern for who heard them. The sounds inside didn't belong to the outside world. They belonged to a plan that had already moved past it. Remaining unnoticed demanded more than stillness. It required subtraction. Light had to be rationed until the rooms felt unfinished. Movement needed justification. Every step weighed against what it might trigger. I stopped thinking in terms of comfort and started measuring exposure, accepting that concealment came with its own erosion. The longer I stayed hidden, the smaller my usable world became. I began shutting things down deliberately. A corridor that offered convenience also offered visibility. So I abandoned it. A workspace with better lighting became unusable once I noticed how its brightness leaked into adjacent spaces. I retreated into areas that felt forgotten, not sealed, but deprioritized. The building didn't discourage access. It simply made some paths less efficient, trusting that no one would choose them unless they had to. That choice carried a price. Air circulation thinned in these marginal zones, cooler and slightly stale. Not dangerous, but persistent. The floor was harder there, the angles less forgiving. Rest came in shorter intervals, never deep enough to lose awareness. Hiding demanded alertness, and alertness burned energy faster than motion ever did. Food wasn't the issue yet. Water wasn't either. The real cost announced itself through uncertainty. I couldn't tell how much tolerance the facility allowed. I didn't know whether prolonged inactivity flagged anomalies or whether consistent presence blended into background noise. There was no feedback loop meant for me. I had to infer limits by absence of response, which meant mistakes would arrive late. I tested boundaries cautiously. A small adjustment in lighting here, a brief use of power there. Each time I waited, watching for changes that might indicate recalibration. Most of the time, nothing happened. That silence encouraged risk, and I had to fight it. Hidden didn't mean safe. It meant deferred. The building's cycles shifted as the night advanced. Internal processes slowed, spacing themselves farther apart, conserving resources. That change reduced cover. Sounds that had once masked movement now arrived less frequently, leaving gaps where any disturbance would stand alone. Staying unseen required timing actions between these intervals, working within shrinking margins. I chose a position near a structural support column, not because it offered protection, but because it reduced my silhouette within the system's geometry. The cameras didn't move, but their coverage overlapped less there. I could exist without aligning perfectly with any single field of view. It wasn't invisibility, it was statistical irrelevance. As hours passed, the outside world pressed closer. Vibrations reached the foundation more often now, heavier, less abstract. I could feel impacts through the floor, distant but rhythmic, like something testing the city's durability. Each time the facility responded by stiffening, redistributing load, isolating stress. It protected itself, not me. That distinction mattered. Staying hidden meant accepting that if conditions changed, I wouldn't be warned. The systems wouldn't escalate on my behalf. If the building decided to seal further, reroute, or purge sections to preserve function, I would be collateral, not a priority. Fatigue set in unevenly. My body wanted rest, but my mind refused it. Every creak of the structure, every subtle pressure shift, demanded interpretation. I was learning a language that never intended to be spoken aloud, let alone understood by someone like me. Fluency came slowly, through repetition I couldn't afford to misread. I thought about leaving, about slipping back through the access point before conditions tightened further. The idea surfaced, lingered, then dissolved. Exposure outside had its own costs, immediate and loud. Here the cost was cumulative, paid in focus, restraint, and the constant awareness that hiding was not a neutral act. By choosing concealment, I had committed to a narrowing path. Options would reduce over time, not expand. Every hour spent unseen made re-entry into the outside world less viable, not because of physical barriers, but because timing and opportunity were slipping away. I adjusted again, reducing my footprint further, committing to fewer movements, fewer variables. The building accepted the change without comment, folding my presence into its margins. That acceptance wasn't kindness. It was conditional tolerance. As the first night deepened, I understood the real price of staying hidden wasn't fear or discomfort. It was momentum. The longer I remained here, the harder it would be to leave without becoming visible at the worst possible moment. Hiding preserved me, but it also bound me, quietly, to a place that measured survival in terms I was only beginning to grasp. Near the end of the internal spine, I noticed details that hadn't registered earlier, not because they were hidden, but because they didn't announce themselves. A scuffed mark along a wall where equipment had been dragged. A thin layer of dust disturbed in a way that suggested recent movement, not age. The facility wasn't as empty as it wanted to appear. I followed those signs cautiously, letting curiosity move slower than caution. In a recessed maintenance bay, a portable light had been mounted and removed, leaving a faint outline where heat had discolored the surface. Nearby, a clipboard rested on a hook, empty of paper but handled often enough that the metal had dulled. Someone had worked here after official operations were supposed to have ceased. Further along, I found a break area stripped of personal items but not cleaned. Cups had been stacked neatly, unused but not discarded. A microwave sat unplugged, door ajar, as if someone had paused mid-task and decided not to finish. The absence of mess felt intentional, controlled. People hadn't fled. They had departed on instruction. The most telling discovery came from a side room marked with a code instead of a name. Inside, a rack of protective gear stood aligned, each piece inspected and returned to position. Some items showed wear, scuffs on helmets, stress marks on gloves, signs of repeated use under pressure. Others looked untouched, reserved. The pattern suggested rotation, not abandonment. I checked the floor and found overlapping footprints, different tread patterns crossing and recrossing the same path. They weren't random. They followed a routine, looping through stations in a sequence that made sense only if someone had been monitoring outcomes. This wasn't a skeleton crew improvising. It was a team following a plan until the moment they stopped. That realization shifted the atmosphere. The building no longer felt indifferent. It felt finished. Whatever purpose it served had reached a stage where human presence was no longer required or no longer permitted. The systems I'd been navigating weren't backups. They were the primary state. I wondered where the people had gone. Evacuation would have left gaps, mistakes, forgotten belongings. Here, everything was staged, minimized, reduced to essentials. The personal had been extracted, leaving behind function without attachment. That kind of departure required time, foresight, and confidence that the environment could sustain itself. In one corner, a whiteboard had been wiped clean except for a single line written small at the bottom edge. I couldn't read it fully, the ink smeared during erasure, but the shape suggested a reminder rather than a warning. Something meant for people who expected to return or who needed to remember why they wouldn't. The implications settled heavily. This facility hadn't been shut down in response to the outbreak. It had been prepared in advance to operate beyond it. The timing of my arrival was incidental. I wasn't early or late. I was irrelevant to its schedule. That understanding reframed my presence. I wasn't trespassing on an abandoned site. I was occupying a space intentionally cleared for autonomous operation. Any accommodation I received was accidental, a side effect of tolerances designed for machines, not bodies. As I moved back into the main corridor, I noticed how pathways subtly guided traffic away from sensitive zones. Floor gradients shifted, lighting softened, acoustics dampened. These weren't security measures meant to stop entry. They were deterrents meant to discourage curiosity without confrontation. I adjusted my behavior accordingly, backing away from areas that felt too deliberate, too carefully preserved. The evidence was clear enough. People had been here, working until very recently, then leaving in an orderly way that implied knowledge I didn't have. That knowledge gap mattered. It meant the worst decisions had already been made somewhere else, by people who understood the system better than I ever would. Whatever they anticipated, they believed this place would outlast the initial chaos without them present. Standing there, surrounded by traces of controlled departure, I understood that survival here wasn't about enduring the outbreak's first night. It was about existing within the aftermath of decisions that had already moved on, leaving me behind inside their margin of error. Structure stayed oblivious toward me. I noticed the lenses only after I stopped looking for them. They weren't mounted where cameras usually sat, not above doors or centered in corners, but recessed into structural seams, embedded in places your eyes slid past without stopping, small dark circles behind protective glass, angled just enough to capture space rather than faces. Once I saw one, I saw more, spaced irregularly, overlapping coverage without forming obvious grids. I stood still and waited for acknowledgement. Nothing happened. No indicator lights changed. No audible cue followed. The system observed without greeting, collected without reacting. That absence of response was more unsettling than an alarm would have been. Alarms announce intent. Silence suggested categorization. I shifted my weight slowly, watching reflections in polished surfaces, tracking how my movement altered the environment. Light adjusted again, but the cameras didn't swivel. They didn't need to. Their fields were already set, optimized for patterns rather than individuals. I understood then that they weren't watching me specifically. They were monitoring conditions, deviations, flows. A wall-mounted display flickered to life nearby, not because I touched it, but because internal cycles dictated it should. Data scrolled past in narrow columns, metrics updating at steady intervals. Occupancy values remained static, unchanged by my presence. That told me everything. Whatever thresholds defined occupied, I didn't meet them. I followed the wiring conduits along the ceiling, tracing where information might travel. They converged toward a central shaft sealed behind reinforced panels, inaccessible without credentials I didn't have. The data wasn't meant to be reviewed locally. It was meant to exist, to be logged somewhere else, or perhaps nowhere at all. Recording without audience. I tested proximity again, stepping closer to one lens, raising my hand slowly into its field. Still nothing. No alert, no correction. The system accepted the input and moved on. That tolerance wasn't generosity. It was calibration. I existed within acceptable variance, a temporary disturbance beneath significance. That realization changed how I moved. I stopped worrying about being seen and focused instead on being interpreted. The difference mattered. Visibility wasn't the trigger. Pattern disruption was. As long as my behavior remained consistent, slow, and non-invasive, the systems had no reason to intervene. I wondered what intervention would even look like. There were no obvious mechanisms for confrontation, no automated locks cycling shut, no audible warnings. Any response would likely be indirect, environmental rather than forceful. Adjustments in airflow, power restriction, compartmentalization. The facility didn't remove problems. It isolated them. That hypothesis gained weight when I noticed subtle changes after prolonged presence in one area. Temperature dropped slightly. Lighting softened further. The space became less comfortable, less attractive, encouraging departure without issuing commands. The system nudged rather than pushed. I tested it again by lingering near a sensitive junction where multiple conduits intersected. Within minutes, the floor beneath my feet cooled noticeably, enough to be distracting. I stepped away, and the change reversed slowly, restoring baseline conditions. It was a conversation without language, boundaries enforced through environment. Outside noise surged again, closer this time, raw and unfiltered. I felt vibrations ripple through the structure, heavy impacts transmitted through foundation supports. The cameras didn't respond. Data streams continued unaltered. The building didn't care who was screaming or breaking things beyond its perimeter. It measured stress, not cause. That distinction clarified the facility's role. It wasn't a refuge or a fortress. It was an observer designed to persist, collect, and maintain continuity regardless of external collapse. Human presence was incidental, tolerated only as long as it didn't interfere with observation or function. I thought about the people who had left. They must have known these systems would keep watching long after they were gone, recording events without context, preserving data stripped of human interpretation. Whatever decisions would be made later would rely on that detached record, not on testimony or memory. Standing beneath lenses that watched without responding, I understood my position more clearly. I wasn't hidden from the system. I was irrelevant to it. As long as I remained so, I could exist within its margins. The moment I mattered, the environment would correct for me, quietly, efficiently, without explanation. That knowledge became its own rule. Survival here depended less on secrecy than on insignificance. I adjusted my behavior accordingly, letting the systems continue their silent observation, hoping never to become something worth responding to. The explanation didn't arrive as a revelation. It assembled itself from absence, from the way space was organized to discourage questions rather than answer them. I stopped looking for a single sign and started reading the building as a sequence of decisions. Every corridor narrowed where curiosity might linger. Every access point deepened the farther it moved from public zones. The architecture wasn't defensive, it was selective. I found a document terminal embedded in a wall panel, its screen dark but warm to the touch. When it activated, it didn't ask for credentials. It displayed archived notices, time-stamped weeks before the city changed, language stripped of urgency, written for internal circulation only. Operational boundaries reinforced, human oversight reduced, physical presence to be minimized after transition phase completion, no mention of threat, no mention of outbreak. Just a shift in priority. That omission mattered. This place hadn't been closed because of danger moving toward it. It had been cleared because something inside needed isolation to function correctly. The absence of people wasn't a precaution. It was a requirement. I followed the logic deeper, moving through zones where design favored containment over access. Floors sloped subtly inward. Walls thickened without visible reinforcement. Materials changed from concrete to layered composites meant to absorb vibration and limit signal bleed. These weren't features meant to protect occupants. They were safeguards meant to protect processes. In a sealed observation room, I found a narrow window overlooking a cavernous space below. Machinery occupied the center, not massive but dense, arranged with precision that suggested sensitivity rather than strength. Conduits fed into it from every direction, data and power converging in a controlled exchange. Whatever happened there didn't tolerate interruption. I didn't need labels to understand the implication. Human presence introduced variables: sound, heat, unpredictability, emotion. All of it degraded the purity of operation. People weren't excluded because they were at risk. They were excluded because they were noise. The building made that clear through hierarchy. Areas closest to the core offered the least accommodation. No seating, no storage, no visual relief. Just function. The farther outward you moved, the more the environment softened, allowing for human tolerance only at the edges. I existed in those margins, not by design, but by oversight. I thought about the warnings I'd seen earlier, the vague phrasing, the selective dissemination. Keeping people away wasn't about preventing panic. It was about preventing interference. The fewer witnesses, the fewer complications. Whatever this facility was responsible for, it required continuity more than accountability. The realization carried a moral weight I hadn't expected. By staying, I wasn't just trespassing. I was compromising something intentionally shielded from human influence. Even without touching controls or altering systems, my presence added variables the designers had worked to eliminate. I searched for evidence of emergency protocols, anything suggesting accommodation for unexpected occupants. There was none. No signage for evacuation, no contingency plans involving people. The assumption was clear. If someone was inside during autonomous operation, they were not part of the equation. That understanding reframed every earlier tolerance. The cameras that didn't react, the systems that adjusted instead of alarming. None of it was mercy. It was insulation. The building absorbed anomalies until they crossed thresholds where correction became necessary. I hadn't crossed one yet. Standing there, looking through reinforced glass at machinery designed to operate without conscience or pause, I understood why access had been restricted long before the outbreak reached public awareness. This place wasn't meant to save lives. It was meant to outlast them. The people who designed it had accepted that distinction. They had removed themselves not because they were afraid, but because their presence was no longer useful. The work mattered more than participation. Survival, in this context, wasn't human-centered. I stepped back from the window and felt the weight of the choice settling in. By remaining here, I wasn't aligning with safety. I was aligning with a priority that ranked continuity above compassion. The first night outside might end in chaos. Inside, the night would pass as scheduled, indifferent to outcomes. That was the reason no one was allowed inside. Not secrecy, not danger, purpose. This place existed to function without negotiation, and the absence of people was the only way to guarantee that function remained uncontaminated. I moved away from the core, retreating toward zones that tolerated my presence. The knowledge stayed with me, heavy and unresolved. Shelter here came at a cost that had nothing to do with comfort or fear. It required accepting that survival sometimes meant existing alongside systems that were never designed to care whether you did. By the time I reached the outer habitation band again, I understood that improvisation would fail me here. Survival couldn't be layered on top of the facility's design. It had to be shaped by it. I stopped thinking about what I needed and started paying attention to what the environment allowed. That shift changed everything. The first adjustment was spatial. I abandoned the idea of claiming a single area and instead rotated through several marginal zones, never long enough to imprint a pattern. Each location offered a different tolerance profile. One handled body heat better, another masked sound during specific internal cycles, a third allowed brief access to utilities without drawing environmental correction. I treated these spaces like tools rather than rooms, using them for purpose, then moving on. Rest required restructuring. Sleeping in long stretches created predictability, so I broke it into fragments timed between system shifts. When airflow altered direction or lighting dimmed, I settled briefly, then relocated before the cycle completed. Fatigue became manageable once I stopped fighting it and started scheduling around it. The facility didn't notice exhaustion. It noticed consistency. Water access proved simple but constrained. The taps delivered steady output, filtered and treated, yet pressure dropped if used too frequently within the same interval. I learned to collect small amounts across different access points, spreading demand so no single node registered sustained draw. The process took longer, but duration mattered less than footprint. Power followed similar logic. Outlets worked until they didn't, cutting output when load exceeded baseline expectations. I avoided charging anything fully, topping off devices in short bursts before moving on. Nothing stayed plugged in long enough to matter. The building rewarded restraint with continuity. But was the one variable I couldn't solve immediately. There were no stores here, no caches meant for people. What little I carried had to last, so I recalculated consumption based on effort rather than hunger. Fewer movements meant fewer calories burned. I trimmed activity until energy use aligned with necessity. Comfort disappeared from the equation. Noise discipline became a form of choreography. I timed steps to coincide with ventilation pulses, repositioned during distant structural vibrations, opened doors only when internal tones peaked. Each action folded into background activity, reducing contrast. I wasn't hiding from sensors. I was camouflaging within patterns already in motion. Mental framing mattered more than I expected. Thinking in terms of resistance created tension. Thinking in terms of compliance reduced it. The facility wasn't an adversary. It was a fixed condition like terrain or weather. Once I accepted that, decision-making simplified. I stopped asking whether something was allowed and focused on whether it would persist. I documented nothing physically. No marks, no notes. Memory carried enough detail. And anything written risked becoming a trace. Instead, I built routines that reinforced themselves through repetition, without mirroring earlier behavior. Variation became protection. Familiarity invited classification. As the hours passed, the environment responded by doing nothing, which was exactly what I wanted. No cooling penalties. No lighting reductions. No subtle nudges toward displacement. The systems registered equilibrium and maintained it. I had aligned my survival methods with the facility's expectations, such as they were. Outside, the night continued to deteriorate. Impacts grew heavier, closer. At one point, a shock traveled through the foundation hard enough to shift dust from ceiling seams. The building redistributed stress and carried on. I adjusted my stance and stayed where I was, trusting the structure to absorb what I couldn't. Rewriting survival meant abandoning instincts shaped by open spaces and human threats. Here, danger wasn't predatory. It was procedural. Mistakes wouldn't chase me. They would accumulate until correction became necessary. That made discipline more important than courage. I tested my new approach once, deliberately lingering in a space longer than usual. Within minutes, airflow altered, becoming cooler and less comfortable. The message was clear and impersonal. I moved on, and conditions normalized. Lesson reinforced. By the end of the night's longest cycle, I had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, if not humane. I wasn't safe in any traditional sense. I was tolerated. That tolerance depended on my willingness to adapt continuously, to reshape needs around constraints rather than push against them. Survival here wasn't about endurance or strength. It was about alignment. As long as I remained a low-impact presence within a system designed to function without me, the facility would continue its work, and I would continue mine, bound together by a fragile equilibrium that neither of us acknowledged openly. Chapter 4, Section 11. Outside becomes unreachable. The shift wasn't announced. Nothing sealed shut. No alarms marked the moment when leaving stopped being a viable option. I realized it only after mapping my own hesitation. Every route I considered carried a cost that no longer balanced against what remained inside. The outside hadn't closed. It had become impractical. I returned to the original access corridor not with the intent to leave, but to reassess it under new conditions. The lighting there remained unchanged, neutral and permissive, yet the vibrations traveling through the walls told a different story. Impacts landed closer now, heavier, irregular. Whatever was happening beyond the perimeter had lost rhythm. The facility compensated, reinforcing load paths, stiffening structural responses in ways I could feel through my feet. I approached the exit door and stopped short of touching it. Through the narrow seams around its frame, I could hear raw sound leaking in, voices overlapping, not shouting in unison but colliding, panicked and fragmented. Metal scraped against pavement. Something shattered, followed by a brief surge of movement that faded just as quickly. The chaos outside no longer passed by. It lingered. Opening that door wouldn't mean stepping back into a familiar environment. It would mean injecting myself into an uncontrolled system that no longer respected predictable behavior. The city had shifted from confusion into reaction, and reaction consumed space aggressively. Any movement outside would be noticed immediately, not by systems, but by people desperate enough to follow it. I stepped away and monitored the facility's response. None came. The building didn't reinforce the exit or restrict access. It didn't need to. The design assumed that once external conditions crossed a certain threshold, the environment would deter departure on its own. Choice narrowed without physical enforcement. Time passed unevenly. Outside noise surged, then dropped into stretches of eerie quiet that felt more dangerous than the noise itself. Each lull suggested repositioning, regrouping, the kind of silence that precedes action. Inside, internal cycles continued, indifferent, providing a stable contrast that made the unpredictability beyond the walls feel even more pronounced. I tried a secondary route, one that led toward a service ramp partially shielded from the street. Halfway there, the acoustics changed sharply. Sounds from above funneled down, amplified by structural geometry. Footsteps echoed close enough that I froze, pressing myself against a wall as shadows crossed a distant light source. I waited, counting breaths, listening for confirmation. None came. Whoever passed hadn't entered the facility, but they were near enough that leaving would have placed me directly in their path. That proximity settled the question. Outside wasn't empty. It wasn't even sparsely occupied. It was contested. Any emergence would require negotiation, speed, and visibility, all of which conflicted with the survival strategy I'd established. The longer I stayed, the more misaligned I would be with that environment. I retreated deeper, not out of fear, but out of assessment. Inside, threats were procedural and legible. Outside, they were adaptive, emotional, and reactive. The facility offered no guidance on this choice because it didn't account for it. It assumed that once autonomous operation began, external interaction was irrelevant. That assumption became my constraint. Leaving now would mean abandoning everything I'd learned about timing, tolerance, and alignment. It would mean trading a system that punished slowly for one that punished immediately. The calculus was no longer about freedom. It was about survivability under known parameters. I marked the exits mentally not as escape routes, but as indicators. Their accessibility remained constant, yet their usefulness diminished with every passing hour. The facility didn't trap me. It waited, confident that external conditions would do the work for it. As the night wore on, outside disturbances crept closer to the building's footprint. Vibrations intensified, then scattered, as if groups were moving through the area in waves. Each time, the structure absorbed the stress and settled. Inside, nothing escalated. The contrast sharpened until it became impossible to ignore. I understood then that the first night had created a boundary more effective than walls. The world beyond had entered a phase where unpredictability was the dominant force. Inside, predictability still existed, bounded but intact. Choosing between them no longer felt like a decision. It felt like an outcome already in motion. I stopped thinking about when I would leave and started thinking about how long alignment could be maintained. Outside wasn't gone. It had simply become unreachable without paying a price I couldn't afford. By accepting that, I crossed an internal threshold. Shelter stopped being temporary. The facility wasn't a pause between dangers anymore. It was the only environment whose rules I could still read. And that made it, for now, the only place where survival remained a matter of discipline rather than chance. Once leaving stopped being an option, something quieter took its place. Not fear, not relief, but a persistent pressure that settled behind every decision. Nothing here explicitly forbade my actions, yet nothing granted approval either. Every movement existed in a grey space, tolerated but unauthorized. That ambiguity carried weight. In normal spaces, rules are reinforced through presence, signs, voices, enforcement. Here, absence performed that role. The lack of instruction forced me to become my own authority, and I quickly learned how exhausting that was. Every choice required justification, not because I feared consequences, but because I feared misalignment. Acting without permission demanded constant self-surveillance. I noticed the shift most when I tried to rest. Lying down didn't bring relief. It invited evaluation. Was this the right place? Was this moment appropriate? Had I stayed too long? The facility never answered, but the question repeated itself internally, reshaping my sense of time. Without external validation, decisions lost finality. Everything felt provisional. I began rationing not just resources, but intent. Actions were filtered through necessity, stripped of impulse. Even harmless behaviors, stretching, adjusting posture, exploring a side corridor required internal debate. The absence of prohibition didn't feel like freedom, it felt like responsibility without guidance. That mental load altered how I perceived myself. I wasn't just surviving within the structure, I was negotiating my legitimacy moment by moment. The knowledge that this place was never meant for people made every footprint feel heavier, every breath more noticeable. I existed as an exception, and exceptions invite scrutiny, even when none arrives. I caught myself waiting for correction, a subtle temperature drop, a light shift, anything that would confirm a boundary had been crossed. When nothing happened, the uncertainty deepened. Consequences delayed are harder to prepare for than immediate ones. The facility trained patience into me without intending to. Memory began to reorganize under that pressure. Thoughts of the outside world lost detail, replaced by calculations rooted entirely in the present environment. My identity narrowed to function. I wasn't a resident or an intruder. I was a variable trying not to matter. That realization carried an unexpected emotional cost. In spaces built for people, survival often reinforces identity. You protect what's yours. You defend who you are. Here, survival demanded erasure. The less I asserted myself, the more sustainable my presence became. That trade-off wasn't physical. It was psychological. I tested it once, deliberately asserting control. I rearranged a piece of furniture in a marginal area, Not for efficiency, but preference. The change felt wrong immediately, not because the system reacted, but because I had imposed choice where none was required. I put it back, unsettled by how quickly the correction eased internal tension. Authority here belonged to design, not decision. The building had no interest in my comfort or my story. It responded only to continuity. Accepting that meant releasing the need to justify myself. The more I aligned with process, the lighter the mental burden became. Still, something resisted. Humans aren't built to exist without acknowledgement. Even hostility provides recognition. Indifference does not. The facility's neutrality forced me inward, stripping away expectations until only behavior remained. I wasn't being judged, but I felt measured. As the night thinned toward morning, that pressure settled into a dull persistence. I understood that if I stayed, this weight wouldn't lift. It would normalize. Permission would never arrive. And eventually, I would stop seeking it. That adaptation carried its own risk. Becoming comfortable without approval could change how I related to the world beyond these walls, if I ever returned to it. For now, I accepted the trade. Survival here required internal compliance, not obedience to rules, but surrender to structure. The psychological cost was real, but manageable, as long as I acknowledged it instead of resisting it. I adjusted my routines again, reducing unnecessary decisions, letting the environment dictate pace. With fewer choices, the pressure eased slightly. The facility didn't notice the change. It never would. But I did, and that awareness became the final resource I had to manage carefully. The first night hadn't just confined my body. It had begun reshaping my sense of agency, teaching me that survival in forbidden places depended less on courage than on the willingness to exist without permission and to carry that silence without breaking. Morning arrived without announcement. No color shift from windows, no change in temperature to mark the passage of time. The facility didn't acknowledge daybreak because daylight had no operational value here. I noticed it only through my own body, a subtle recalibration as fatigue changed texture, sharpening instead of deepening. Night had ended somewhere outside. Inside, conditions persisted. I moved carefully through the habitation band, checking for changes I might have missed while resting in fragments. Lighting levels remained stable. Airflow followed the same patterns I had memorized. The systems hadn't escalated, relaxed, or adapted in response to whatever the city had endured while I stayed hidden. That constancy carried an unsettling implication. Whatever thresholds governed this place had not been crossed by the night's events. External sound returned gradually, not as chaos, but as residue. Distant engines idled too long. Metal clattered, then fell quiet. Voices drifted intermittently, stripped of urgency, carrying exhaustion rather than panic. The outbreak hadn't resolved itself. It had settled into a new phase, one defined by aftermath instead of shock. Morning didn't bring clarity. It brought persistence. I approached an observation slit near the facility's upper perimeter, one of the few points where outside conditions could be sensed indirectly. Through layered materials, I caught fragments of movement. Shadows crossing reflective surfaces, smoke thinning as it dispersed into cooler air. The city looked altered, not destroyed, but reshaped by overnight decisions made under pressure. Improvisation had hardened into habit. Inside, the building continued its routines with measured detachment. Status displays updated at the same intervals. Internal tones followed their established cadence. Nothing suggested urgency or reassessment. The facility hadn't spent the night bracing for impact. It had simply remained itself. That realization carried weight. I had survived the first night by aligning with a structure that didn't recognize night or day as meaningful distinctions. Morning offered no reset here, no emotional lift, no sense of completion. The danger outside hadn't passed, and the safety inside hadn't improved. Conditions were stable, and stability could be deceptive. I assessed my position with new criteria. Resources remained limited but sufficient. Tolerance thresholds hadn't shifted. External unpredictability persisted. The calculus hadn't changed, only its duration. What I had treated as a temporary shelter now demanded consideration as a longer-term environment, not because it offered comfort, but because it offered continuity. The psychological shift was subtle but unmistakable. During the night, survival had felt reactive, a sequence of adjustments made under uncertainty. With morning, it became anticipatory. I wasn't responding to immediate threat anymore. I was preparing for sustained exposure to a world that no longer corrected itself quickly. I tested the facility again, introducing minimal variation to see if diurnal cycles altered its responses. They didn't. Temperature held. Lighting remained constant. The building didn't track time the way people did. Its rhythms were internal, decoupled from the sun. That separation reinforced its purpose. It wasn't meant to coexist with human routines. It was meant to persist independently of them. Outside, the city began to reorganize, not toward recovery, but toward endurance. I could hear it in the sounds that returned. Measured footsteps instead of running, short exchanges instead of shouting, the clatter of makeshift tools replacing random destruction. Morning hadn't ended the outbreak. It had introduced adaptation. That parallel unsettled me. Inside, I had adapted by becoming less visible, less demanding, less human in my needs. Outside, others were adapting by asserting control over fragments of their environment, reshaping chaos into something manageable. Two different responses to the same collapse, moving in opposite directions. I understood then that the first night hadn't been a threshold. It had been an initiation. The absence of relief in the morning wasn't an oversight. It was the new baseline. Whatever followed would not build toward resolution. It would extend from this point forward, accumulating consequences rather than releasing them. I stepped back from the observation slit and re-entered the interior circulation, letting the facility's neutrality recalibrate my focus. Hope had no function here, neither did despair. What mattered was sustainability under fixed constraints. Morning didn't offer answers, it offered confirmation. The systems accepted my continued presence without modification. That acceptance was conditional, unchanged by time of day or external developments. As long as I remained aligned, I would be tolerated. As long as I remained tolerated, I could persist. The first night had ended. Survival had not improved. It had simply stabilized into something quieter, longer, and more demanding. Morning brought no relief because relief was never part of the design, either outside or within these walls. The choice arrived without drama, shaped by accumulation rather than urgency. I didn't wake to a crisis or a signal demanding action. Instead, the decision formed while everything stayed the same. That constancy forced clarity. Waiting no longer preserved options. It narrowed them. I returned to the access corridor one final time, not to test it, but to close a loop in my thinking. The door remained unlocked, unchanged since the night before. Its surface reflected light evenly, unmarred by impact or tampering. Beyond it, sound drifted in fragments. Organized voices now, fewer overlaps. Purposeful movement. The outside had found structure, not safety. That distinction mattered. Leaving would require speed, exposure, negotiation. I would have to reintroduce myself into a system rebuilt overnight by people adapting under pressure. I would arrive without context, without allegiance, without leverage. Every step would demand explanation I couldn't provide. Inside the facility, explanation was irrelevant, alignment was enough. I didn't touch the door. I stepped back and felt the weight of that restraint settle. It wasn't fear that stopped me. It was commitment. Once I accepted that survival here depended on continuity rather than escape, the calculus shifted. This place offered predictability at the cost of permission. Outside offered autonomy at the cost of volatility. The first night had taught me which cost I could manage. I began consolidating not resources but intent. I chose 3 zones to rotate through instead of 5, reducing movement further. I accepted longer intervals of stillness, trusting my understanding of internal cycles to compensate. Every adjustment tightened my integration, reducing the likelihood of correction. The decision wasn't to stay forever. It was to stay long enough that staying became the default. That distinction mattered. Permanence declared itself through behavior, not intention. By reshaping routines around endurance rather than exit, I locked the future into a narrower channel. I marked the change internally. From this point forward, I wouldn't plan around departure windows. I would plan around tolerance limits. That reframing simplified decisions immediately. Actions no longer needed to preserve optionality. They needed only to maintain equilibrium. The facility responded by doing nothing, which confirmed the choice. No environmental nudges followed. No cooling penalties or lighting shifts accompanied the consolidation. The systems registered continuity and maintained it. I had crossed an internal threshold without triggering an external one. Outside, the city's sounds stabilized into a pattern I could predict by absence rather than presence. Peaks and lulls arrived on a schedule shaped by human behavior reclaiming space. That rhythm felt increasingly incompatible with the one governing the structure around me. Divergence widened quietly. I thought about the people who had cleared this place intentionally. They had made the same calculation at a different scale. They had chosen continuity over participation, function over visibility. Understanding that lineage eased the decision's weight. I wasn't inventing a new path. I was stepping into one already defined. There was risk in that. Aligning with a system indifferent to human outcomes meant accepting unknown endpoints. The facility might complete its purpose and change state. It might isolate further. It might initiate processes I couldn't anticipate. Staying bound me to outcomes beyond my control. Leaving would bind me to outcomes shaped by others. Control was limited either way. I reorganized my carried items, shedding anything that encouraged mobility. Excess weight invited impulse. Minimalism reinforced commitment. Each discarded object felt like a quiet agreement with the structure, a signal that I wasn't preparing to move quickly. As the day progressed, internal cycles adjusted slightly, not in response to me, but in accordance with their own logic. I adapted again, matching pace, letting alignment deepen. The decision embedded itself through repetition, becoming less a choice and more a condition. By late morning, the access corridor no longer represented an option. It became a reference point, a marker of divergence rather than escape. I stopped checking it. Attention shifted inward, towards sustainability under fixed parameters. Locking the future didn't require a declaration. It required consistency. By choosing predictability over possibility, I had committed to a form of survival that traded freedom for coherence. The facility accepted that trade without acknowledgement. The first night had demanded adaptation. The morning demanded decision. I made it quietly, without witnesses, knowing that from this point forward, survival would be measured not by days endured, but by how completely I could integrate into a place that never asked me to stay and never intended to let me matter. The realization didn't strike all at once. It settled gradually, threading itself through small observations until it became impossible to ignore. Survival here wasn't a victory condition. It was an ongoing exchange, one that demanded payment long before any benefit became visible. The facility offered continuity, but it charged for it in ways that weren't listed or measured. I began to understand the cost through absence. No voices echoed inside these walls unless I made them. No opinions challenged my choices. No one observed my persistence with approval or doubt. That isolation stripped survival of narrative. There was no story unfolding here, only process extending itself forward. Endurance existed without witnesses, and that changed its meaning. Outside, people would measure survival by proximity to others, by shared danger and mutual response. Inside, survival was solitary and procedural. Each day that passed without incident reinforced alignment, but also deepened separation. The more I adapted to this environment, the less transferable that adaptation became. Skills honed here would not apply easily elsewhere. The facility reinforced that lesson subtly. The longer I remained, the more my routines synchronized with internal cycles instead of human rhythms. Hunger followed output, not time. Rest followed system shifts, not fatigue. My body adjusted, but the adjustment felt conditional, dependent on remaining within these constraints. Survival had become location-specific. I tested my own reactions to outside stimuli, listening to distant movement without urgency, feeling vibrations without interpreting them as immediate threat. That numbness wasn't apathy. It was recalibration. The building had trained me to prioritize stability over response, endurance over intervention. That mindset protected me here, but I wondered how it would translate beyond these walls. There was a deeper cost as well, one I couldn't quantify. By aligning with a system indifferent to human outcomes, I was accepting a worldview shaped by function rather than value. The facility didn't distinguish between lives saved or lost. It measured performance. Remaining here meant internalizing that metric, at least partially. I thought about the moment I might eventually leave. If such a moment arrived, I would carry this alignment with me, consciously or not. Decision-making would favor predictability. Risk tolerance would narrow. The chaos of human environments might feel abrasive, inefficient, wrong. Survival here was shaping preference, not just behavior. That understanding reframed the choice I had made earlier. Staying wasn't just about weathering the outbreak's early phase. It was about committing to a form of survival that traded adaptability for coherence. Inside these walls, coherence was rewarded. Outside, adaptability would be. I noticed how little I reacted now when internal systems shifted. Changes that once demanded attention had become background conditions. That fluency felt earned, but it also signaled absorption. The facility hadn't changed to accommodate me. I had changed to accommodate it. The cost extended into identity. Without external reference points, my sense of self narrowed to function and observation. I wasn't defined by relationships, roles, or intentions. I was defined by persistence. That simplification made survival efficient, but it hollowed something out at the edges. I accepted that hollowing as part of the transaction. Survival, in its purest form, didn't guarantee preservation of everything that made living meaningful. It guaranteed continuity. Meaning, if it returned, would have to be rebuilt later, under different conditions. As the day moved forward, internal cycles repeated, unbroken and unconcerned. The facility continued its work. I continued mine. The equilibrium held, and with it the quiet understanding that this arrangement could last longer than expected, perhaps longer than intended. The first night had driven me here. The second day had confirmed the cost. Survival inside forbidden spaces wasn't heroic or dramatic. It was disciplined, impersonal, and quietly transformative. Every hour I remained, I paid a little more of myself into a system that neither noticed nor cared, in exchange for time. That was the final truth the place offered. Survival would not end the story. It would change its shape, narrowing it, stripping it down to essentials. I had taken shelter where no one was allowed, and in doing so I had accepted a version of survival that asked for silence, alignment, and patience as payment. The world outside would continue to fracture, reorganize, and adapt. Inside, the facility would persist, steady and indifferent. Between those two trajectories, I existed as a temporary overlap, living proof that survival sometimes meant choosing a path that preserved life while quietly rewriting everything else that life had been built around.